Welcome to the Reform Review. This is a pretty important day, I would say. We're here to not only talk about the Citizenship Act of 2021, but really go into the details of it. I will say that it is a very, very lengthy document, so it's over 350 pages, and I've done my best to read through as much as possible. However, I am going to be limiting today's to one of the first sections, which is about the earned path to citizenship. But before really getting into that, I do want to give maybe some history or context to the bill now. If you remember, back in January, on January 20th, Joe Biden's first day in office, he introduced his proposal for the U.S. Citizenship Act. It more so gave broad outlines of what his view is of immigration reform and how the immigration system should function. Now, after nearly a month, on February 18th, so very, very recently, Senator Bob Menendez and Representative Linda Sanchez, Bob Menendez being from New Jersey and Representative Sanchez being from California, introduced the bill in both the U.S. Senate and in the U.S. House of Representatives, respectively. So I do want to caution that this is, one, is not the end, right? Just because it's been introduced does not mean that we've won the battle. We are just in the very beginning. This is the time that we should be building support around this issue and calling and demanding action from our representatives, which I'll go into more detail later. But I also do want to say that this is very highly partisan. Only Democrats, as of this kind of live session, only Democrats have shown support for the bill. This is mostly because a lot of the critique or feedback has been that it's too overreaching, it's too radical of a push at once. I would disagree. I think that this is what is necessary to make sure that we're pulling everyone up together. And also that when it comes to immigration reform, we should be more radical, right? Radical when proposing our position and then negotiating from that stand rather than sort of like going from the very bare minimum and then trying to force the fight up the hill. So I think this is a good start. I'm not 100% sure how much of it will end up in the final bill, unfortunately, because it does cover a lot. And even some things that I didn't expect, which I'll actually talk about today, is something very surprising. That's wonderful news for anyone who's deported or left the country by choice within the past 4 years. It's something amazing, and I'll go into those details. But to give you more information on the Citizenship Act, it's actually made up of 5 titles, or we'll call it sections for this feed. But the first one is the Earned Path to Citizenship and Other Reforms. That includes sort of the highlight or what we're really fighting for in this campaign, which is a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented immigrants, and also different pathways for other immigrants who don't fall in that traditional undocumented immigrant profile. The second section is about addressing the root causes of migration and responsibly managing the southern border. This is about trying to really address that stem of why are people actually leaving their home and venturing, this rather dangerous path to get to this country. So that's really what that section is about. The next one is about reforming the immigrant visa system, right? So that's the third section. That is really about trying to address, one critique I would say is that trying to create pathways for citizenship for undocumented immigrants, there's the pushback from a more conservative angle where they argue that they're cutting the line is not fair to those who are in line legally. Well, part of this comprehensive reform is about reforming the actual immigration system as a whole, meaning even for those who are in line waiting, to make it more efficient, to make it more fair and more just. So that's what is covered in really that section 3. But equally is in section 4, immigration courts, family values, and vulnerable individuals. How do we reform our courts to make up for really the backlog that has built up over time, which has prevented people from coming to this country in a legal manner? And the last piece involves employment authorization and trying to protect workers from exploitation, which I think is just a fantastic piece to include in this. So those are the 5 overall sections of the U.S. Citizenship Act. for the purpose of this live talk, I'm more so going to focus on the first section, right? The earned path to citizenship. That first section is made up into two. The first piece has really this pathway to citizenship and also other reforms. Those other reforms will be covered in future video. This one I really do want to dedicate it to the earned path to citizenship because it is so massive. It's very, very lengthy, and it has a lot of particular details on who qualifies for these relief policies. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about going forward. And of course, if anyone has questions, feel free to leave it in the comments. I do want to caution, though, I'm not a legal expert, right? So do not take this as legal advice. I'm here to just educate the community and for us to be able to fight a more effective, organized front for reform. So really, to start, what we're seeing in this earned path to citizenship, because that is the name that is under, we have three tracks for relief. Now, the first one I'll cover is more of a general track, right? What is the process that someone has to go through when they are here in this country without status and they apply to the relief program if it is passed, to then have a change of status, to then finally get a green card, right? So that's really what we'll talk about in the general track. I call the next piece a humanitarian track. Other sort of organizations and other groups have not really included it as its own separate track, but I would say that what is required to use that track is very specific, and so it should merit its own section, and that's what I'll talk about soon. And the last piece is a fast track, which has three different options within it. That one needs to be on its own because of the fact that it includes DACA. It will have the DREAM Act being passed within it, along with different avenues for TPS holders and even for agricultural workers, which I think is an amazing thing since they work very, very hard to provide the food that we eat all throughout the country. So to start with the general track, I'm going to throw up a general slide to show you the overall process, and then I'll come back to go one by one. So as you see here, it is the general track, which is the change of statuses. You're going from being undocumented or a non-citizen, which, by the way, this bill now removes any mention of the word alien and replaces it with the word non-citizen. It's really in the line of trying to be more humane to immigrants and recognizing that, we're all people. So this is really the overarching process that you can expect to see when it comes to the changing of status over time. I'll go one by one, and we're going to really start with that first piece, right? So going from being, what happens during the time that you're going from being undocumented or a non-citizen to actually applying for this relief? Well, immediately, and I think this is a wonderful thing, is you receive advance parole. So from the time that you apply, right, to the time that the Secretary of Homeland Security or their office, right, the Department of Homeland Security, delivers their decision to you, whether you're being approved to go through this relief or being denied, you are not allowed to be deported from the United States. So it is advance parole. You are here in this country, you're being recognized. But to be very clear, right, as you can see here, you are not considered you're not considered an unauthorized non-citizen, meaning that that's why you're not up for deportation or detention. However, that doesn't make you authorized. Right? So there's certain things that you still cannot do. However, one of the great things is that the receipt of application, right? So that you've sent your application, you're trying to regularize your status, can be used as work authorization. So from the moment that you apply, and you receive your receipt that it has been received and it is going to be processed and reviewed, you are now able to work in the U.S. Employers are protected under the bill that if they know, right, if they know that one of their workers is a non-citizen who is going through this process, they are protected from any liability. They will not be punished for maintaining them under their employment. So it's really just about starting the process and then coming out of the shadows to really work like anyone else. And so I do want to also mention that because this is still, a bill, it hasn't been passed, I am not sure what that processing time would look like. It depends on resources. It depends on manpower. It really depends on what is put in line in advance to get it going, right? To get a running start. So do keep that in mind when going forward. Now, the other piece that I need to kind of cover here is that overall, if this were to pass, there's a certain time period that you need to be aware of. It is about making sure that the greater portion of it within 1 year, I would say, is what it would take to fully implement this kind of a reform. So say that we do manage to get it passed, that's perfect. Only issue is that you won't be able to automatically go out and apply right away. Again, the process is still to be determined, but do keep that in mind that you will have some hangover time waiting for it to be implemented. So if anyone out there, right, this is a general advice, if anyone right now or even later, right away, is an attorney or any kind of a representative claims that they can help you prepare to receive the reform, to apply for protection under the reform, do not listen to them. It's fraud right now. There's no avenue right now that exists just because it was introduced. So please, go into this with the mindset that nothing is set in stone right now, and to be aware that there are people out there who will take advantage of this. So please make sure, family, friends, let them know if they are very hopeful that this passes, to not give into a lot of the fraud that will be coming down this way. While we're on this point, actually, right, the process of going and applying, I do want to now cover really the nitty-gritty details of the eligibility requirements, because this is really important to have an idea if you are going to be able to benefit from this or not, right? So the initial steps are very simple of what's required for an applicant to just apply. The first piece is one of the most obvious pieces. It's just an on-time submission of a completed application. Whatever their avenue of time, they're going to decide that later. There's nothing written in stone yet. As I mentioned, the final rules will be within a year's time out of the enactment of the bill. Now, the second thing that you need to know of what makes you eligible is that you need to be able to pay the associated fees with the application. So this is only for non-citizens over the age of 18. They will have to pay a processing fee, and that processing fee will depend, right? It'll range depending on how much it costs to process the application. The Secretary of Homeland Security is going to be the one with that power to limit the overall max cost by a family, and they can also actually provide exemptions from the application fee, depending on whether or not it's a good cause. That's, again, there's no clear definition of what a good cause is for the time being, but you can always expect that it's going to be something involving financial burden or circumstances outside of your control. Again, I will leave that to more of a legal expert down the road when this is more concrete and hopefully being passed. Now, those are the first two, right? So it's your on-time submission and your payment of the processing fees. These two will be very consistent right now in the general track, but also overall in the humanitarian track and in the fast track especially. This is going to be a very recurring point. But for the general track, you have to be able to show physical presence, but not just being in the country for just a small period of time. It has to be continuous. So you have to be in person to submit the application. So you have to be within the U.S. to actually submit your application. That is a requirement. So you cannot be in your home country of origin and then apply. The other thing is that you need to be in the U.S. You have to have been here continuously beginning on January 1st of this year, right? So January 1st, 2021. And you had to be here consistently all the way through till your application is approved, right? So from the start of this year to the time that you apply, to the time it's being processed, to the time that you receive word saying you have been approved, then you're fine. But you are not allowed to leave until that happens. There is some exceptions. So that's the thing. It's going to be up to the Secretary of Homeland Security to clearly outline the rules of what are exceptions in this case. Sometimes it might be humanitarian, right, for a very good reason, maybe illness or something along those lines. Or if it was very brief. As long as you're not going outside the country for more than 180 days within a calendar year, it shouldn't be seen as sort of a very lengthy period outside of the U.S. Now, that's sort of like the process, the general process of being eligible for this. So to kind of complement that, we need to also look at what makes you ineligible, because that's also very important to know where you stand right now. So immediately is if you have any felony offenses, right? So anything especially violent, you will not be able to qualify for this. So I think that's a very clear and cut and dry requirement. The other thing is you cannot have 3 or more misdemeanors. So yeah, just be very careful on that end. Try and stay on the right side and be careful with the misdemeanors because they seem like they won't affect too much. But once you hit 3, you're no longer able to qualify for any of the relief under any of these different routes. So do keep that in mind. Although there are some exceptions, actually. One of them is the simple possession of cannabis, marijuana, or any kind of related products along those lines. There's also the exception that if you had the offense happen during a time that it was in a state that you were convicted, but now that same crime is no longer prosecutable, then that's also an exception. You'll have to be able to explain this in your application, and there'll be a way to make that case. But do keep that in mind. Another exception is that your immigration status cannot be used against you as a misdemeanor or as a crime that will sort of be used against your benefit for your application. Also, if you are an activist, right, if you happen to go out to protest and you were arrested for civil disobedience without violence, that cannot be used against you as a misdemeanor. So that will have to be removed. It's an exception. And any minor traffic offense. So again, always try and keep it minimal, right? Don't run red lights or anything like that. But those minor traffic offenses are an exception to the misdemeanor. So those will not count to your 3. Again, it's only 3. So be very, very careful going forward. There are certain waivers when it comes to these misdemeanors, sort of like a delay or a consideration. For example, if you have one misdemeanor offense, as long as it was not within the past 5 years before you apply, that can be waived. Similarly, for 2 misdemeanors, so like really hitting the threshold there, like right before hitting 3, that will have to be that you had 10 years prior to your application without any other misdemeanor. So it's just about being very careful, keeping track of what has happened if you've been involved with the justice system to see where you land there, right? If you've only had 1 misdemeanor on your record, fine, as long as you've had 5 years without any other misdemeanors up to the point that you apply. Same thing, 2 misdemeanors, you need 10 years of a buffer before you apply. So keep that in mind, because otherwise you will be ineligible. There's other different waivers when it comes to ineligibility. Really, again, humanitarian, up to discretion for the Secretary of Homeland Security. So I cannot define it right now, really beyond humanitarian purposes for family unity, or as they say, public interest. So those rules will have to be more detailed in the future, but just to put it out on your radar right now. There are also certain types of immigrant statuses that will be ineligible automatically. To no surprise, a lawful permanent resident, so someone who is already with their green card, will not be able to apply for this, right? It doesn't make sense that they would be within that scope. Also, refugees and asylum people who've been granted asylum, they will not be able to apply for this kind of a relief. And also, and this is a very important point that I need to make, if a non-citizen who's not eligible has a spouse and a child, and that spouse or child are eligible, the ineligibility of the non-citizen, right, the primary person, does not affect the eligibility of the spouse or the child. They are able to actually apply independently of each other. Of course, you will have to go through the same process, right? A processing fee, the actual application submission, and then background checks. That's the other thing. Everything has to have a background check. So when you're going through the general track, you will have a background check for public safety, national security, everything under the sun. You're going to have a background check. And then even when you're transitioning from status to status later in the path, you'll have more background checks to make sure everything is fine. We'll get to that on the next piece. And also general ineligibility in the sense of where you were in the US when this was getting kind of planned out. If you were outside the US on January 1st, right, of this year, so 2021, you are ineligible because you missed that window. You had to have been here on or before January 1st. And if you re-entered the US unlawfully after January 1st, so if you were here beforehand, right, you were here and you either departed voluntarily or you were deported, and then you came back on January 2nd unlawfully, you will no longer be eligible for relief, which is unfortunate because, again, as I'm going to mention, there is a path to citizenship for people who were deported over the past 4 years. So once you hear those details, you'll understand why this is a little bit of a bad situation to be in if you decide to come back without knowing this. Another important note before we transition onto the next piece, onto the next change of status, applying for relief under this act does not bar you from seeking relief through any other act. So if life circumstances change, you get a sponsor, unfortunately you're a victim of domestic violence, if there's another way that you're able to pursue protection, right, legal protection, or even a pathway to citizenship, you are not forced to go down this pathway just because you're starting to apply for it. You're able to do both, I believe, or again, not a legal expert, but one does not bar you from the other. So do keep that in mind. It's going to be, if this were to pass, it is definitely worthwhile to at least go for it. And this last piece, again, is to kind of go back to what this means, right? The advanced parole is that those who are applying will be recognized as being initially appearing to be eligible, right? And this is why you cannot be removed until the Secretary of Homeland Security Department, has issued a final decision denying you access to this relief. Right? So this is going to go on. So they have to deny your request, then they have to have it, a final order of removal has to be issued from the department, and then that final removal has to be upheld by a court, and any extrajudicial review has to have expired. So there's going to be a very, very long process of due process when it comes to if you are denied for relief, which means that you'll have a good amount of time to be able to prepare any kind of legal defense or to prepare in general for what might happen if you are denied. There's no clear specification of what happens in the case of denial, because it could really range of the reason why you might be getting denied. So again, I had to leave that for a later time when those rules are finalized by the Secretary of Homeland Security. I fortunately cannot make those decisions on my own. And another last important piece is that spouses and children can actually apply with a principal applicant in a family application. So everyone can apply together. It'll just be one application and just one processing fee, I believe. The only thing is, you gotta make sure you all do the background checks, right? That's required overall, but they do not have to do any of the extra work or paperwork that's associated with getting a principal applicant checked through. So that's something to know. now I do want to go on to sort of the second piece, right, which is what happens when you are an applicant now and you're going through the change of process to be a lawful prospective immigrant, right? So that is actually the new status that has been made for this bill. It is lawful prospective immigrant status. So bury it in your mind, because you're going to hear it a lot going forward. Now, what do you need to actually apply for this? Right, so that's another question. If you find that you're eligible, right, after we went through all the eligibility requirements, now what do you actually need to apply for this reform? Well, you have to first establish your identity, right? Now that you've kind of went through the basics of, okay, I've been here, I can show that I've been physically present. What do you need to establish your identity? Really the usual kind of stuff. If you have your passport or a national ID from your country of origin, perfect. It just needs to have your name, your photograph, or a fingerprint, depending on what country they'll have that. Second, if you happen to have birth certificate, right, or an identity card that also, again, includes your name and photograph. So that's the very important piece. It has to have your name, has to have your photograph. And so we're just going down the list of the different things that you could have. There's also a school ID, right? So again, name, photograph, but it needs to be accompanied with school records showing the name and that they were enrolled at that school. So this is, it could be college, it could be public school. You need to just have those kind of records in tandem. There's also, if you happen to have served in the military, right? So uniform services, you'll have an ID card from the Department of Defense. That also applies for this. If you have any other immigration-related documents from the U.S. government that has your name and photograph, that's for use. So again, this would more so be along the lines for like DACA, TPS, right? People who've already been engaged with the U.S. government. Someone who's just undocumented outside of the system may not have these ones, but they may have some of the earlier examples of a passport from their home country, hopefully. And also, if you happen to have a state-issued ID card with a name and photograph. So throughout the country, we've seen push campaigns for a state driver's license. So that could actually be used to help with this process. So if your state has it, great, go and apply for it because it won't hurt you to get the state ID. And to kind of wrap up, how do you establish your identity? It's really up to the discretion, again, of the Secretary of Homeland Security. They will determine what counts as credible, what doesn't, and they actually have the authority to change this at really any time after public review. So do keep that in mind. This is just me going off what we have right now. In a few months, depending on what happens, we may have to revisit this and see where it now stands. In terms of establishing your continuous physical presence here, that is, there's a lot of options that you have. So the last one we had six different ways that you can establish your identity. This one we have 17, so a lot. If you happen to have your passport entries, including any admission stamps, that can count. Any document from the Department of Justice or Department of Homeland Security that notes your date of entry into the U.S., that counts. Records from any institution of higher ed that you've attended in the U.S., that can also help. Again, you will have to be able to manufacture enough documents to show your continuous physical presence over time. Any employment records where you have that include the employer's name and their contact info, so their phone number, mostly. Any records from military service, that also counts. Even records from your religious entity, right? Actually being participating in any religious ceremony, that can also count. If you happen to have a child in the U.S., right? So you're a non-citizen, but your child is a U.S. citizen. If you happen to have their birth certificates for when they were born, that can also count for your physical presence. Any hospital records associated with either your own treatment, hospitalization, that needs to come along with the name of the medical facility or physician and the particular date that you received treatment or you were hospitalized. Any deeds, mortgages, rental agreement contracts, so make sure to keep this all in line. Even your rent receipts or your utility bills, as long as it has the name or the name of an immediate family member and the address where you're living, that can also be used. Any tax receipts that you've paid, insurance policies, Really, there's a lot of possibility of what you need to collect now to show that you've been in the country since January 1st. For some routes, you'll have to show a little bit more time, and I'll explain that soon. Even your bank transactions or any travel records, actually. So this is a rather interesting one. So that includes plane, bus, train tickets, itineraries, hotel receipts. All of that can actually count to helping you prove your continuous physical presence. So anything that has your name, anything that has a date, that needs to be saved now for later on to show that you've been in this country since January 1st consistently, that you have not left the country at all. So do keep that in mind. You can also have, if you happen to have two individuals who can write an affidavit, right, that's recognized and sworn on, that can also help cover this piece. However, it will need to contain their name, their address, the phone number, and the nature and duration of the relationship that they have with you. So do keep that in mind if you want to go down that route. Now, to kind of go more into this detail, we kind of went through what's necessary, right? Are you eligible? What is the process to apply? So now I do want to talk a little bit more about what it means to be a lawful prospective immigrant, right? Because it's a very new term introduced in this bill, and it's going to be what many people hopefully will be in the future. So to become a lawful prospective immigrant, right? To become a lawful prospective immigrant, you had to hit what we mentioned before. You had to have your background checks clear. You had to pay any associated fees with the processing of your application or background checks, and you had to submit your application, of course, right? That's the only way to go through this process. Again, just as a reminder, spouses and children can be included in the family application, or they can also apply separately. Now, if you do receive this status, many things happen. One, the duration of the status, just to get that out the way, this status is valid for 6 years, and it can be extended for another 6, so you can renew it. But you have to do that in year 5, right? So it's a duration of 6. Once you hit year 5, that's where you have to make a decision. And as I mentioned here, right there, right, minimum of 5 years in status to then be able to transition into the next status. Or you can renew and stay within this prospective immigrant status if at that time you're not feeling ready to transition into the next piece. There's nothing wrong with it. It's, again, going to be up to the applicants or the people who are in that status. Now, what happens here is once you successfully become a lawful prospective immigrant, you receive an evidence, documentary evidence is what it's called, right? That's the more technical name. Essentially, you're going to get an ID of sorts, right? You're going to get an identification card that shows that you have this legal status, right? Because you go from not being unauthorized, right, to being lawfully present. And that is very important because not only do you get the benefits of not being deported, not being detained, you actually become eligible for quite a bit. You're now able to qualify for different health plans. You get to maintain your work authorization, much more stable, much more concrete. And actually, you're able to travel outside of the U.S. the moment that you become a lawful prospective immigrant. I do want to just mention that there is like a small caveat to that. You're able to travel outside the U.S., but you have to make sure not to exceed 180 days within a single calendar year of travel outside of the U.S. It's just to make sure that you're within the U.S., that everything's fine. I'm not 100% sure as to why 180, but just do keep that in mind. Enjoy the travel, enjoy the new freedom that this would bring, but it has to be limited to 180 days until you go into the next status change. And lastly, you do get your Social Security number, which then allows you to continue paying taxes and really just to enjoy a normal life within the country. So that is really what this status means and why it's so significant, right? It's a completely new status that you get from successfully applying to the reform relief. Now, as I mentioned, right, there's the 5-year minimum. Once you hit year 5, again, you can either just renew and stay within this status, or you can actually now transition into being a lawful permanent resident. Clear cut, simple. It means that you're really at a green card status. From this point on, it's just like the same as any other green card holder. You don't have to worry about your travel. And again, you're really in the final steps to citizenship at this point. It's 3 years to be a citizen, and that's really the pathway. Again, I'm going to throw this up, the sort of general piece there, just to show you again, right? This is the whole process. It's going from being undocumented or non-citizen to applying, right? You receive that initial protection, to then being an applicant going on and having a change of status to lawful prospective immigrant, which brings you not only the protection, but the benefits of being in this country, right? Of being able to have a healthcare plan, having work authorization to be able to travel freely. Again, limited to 180 days, but still great opportunity. And of course, you get your social security number to begin paying taxes. And also, it's important to note that you have to pay, you have to pay your taxes over those entire 8 years, right? So your 5-year minimum, and over those 3 years that you transition to the lawful permanent resident, if your intention is especially, one, to become a lawful permanent resident, and to eventually become a citizen of the United States. So the moment you're able to pay taxes, do it, right? They will be checking, especially during the background check portions, because the transition to lawful permanent residence will also include a background check. So quite a bit of information there, a lot of different sort of requirements, eligibility considerations, but overall, I would say that is really what we're looking at when it comes to general track, right? So this is open to really anyone, again, as long as they were here consistently from January 1st of this year, 2021, and they're able to kind of prove that they've been here for that time, and they've not committed any felonies, they've not committed more than 3 misdemeanors, you qualify to then apply for this. Now, as I mentioned earlier, right, we're kind of going to revisit this. We've gone over the general track. Now it's this second one, which is a humanitarian track, is what I call it personally. It's not the official name. So if you were to say that to someone, they won't know what you're talking about. But I call it the humanitarian track because there's actually an exception to the rule of applying physically in the U.S. And it's based on a more humanitarian approach of whether or not you were removed or you voluntarily departed from the U.S. over the past 4 years. So I'm going to actually throw this up for you. It shows the requirements for this to actually work, right? So if you were removed or departed from January 20th, 2017, all the way up to January 1st, 2021, if you were removed or departed in those 4 years, you meet half of the requirements, because the other piece is that you also have to have been present in the U.S. no less than 3 years prior to your removal. That's a slight typo there, and I'll fix it later, but it should say prior to your removal or the departure. So do keep that in mind, right? So this is really for anyone going through that process, because this will actually waive the requirement to be physically present in the U.S. When applying for relief, because that is actually the requirement that you have to meet to begin along the general track. So this is an amazing opportunity for those who have been deported over the past 4 years under the Trump administration, when it's such a heightened immigration enforcement time. They have an opportunity to actually apply for a pathway to citizenship to come back to the U.S. Again, the reasons for this being permitted depend. It is definitely more along the lines of humanitarian purposes or to ensure family unity. So you would have to make a case in front of a judge, right? You have to be able to represent yourself. So if you know someone who would benefit from this, please let them know that this is an option, because it really did surprise even myself when I read this in the bill, I did not expect them to include something like this in there. And also, somewhere at the end of that statement, at the very bottom, you'll see that as long as the applicant has not re-entered the U.S. unlawfully after January 1st, right? So this is something I had mentioned earlier as something that makes you ineligible right off the bat. So if you know someone who was deported over the past 4 years, who was here for 3 years leading up to that point, right, a minimum of 3 years up to the point that they were deported or that they voluntarily left the U.S., and they have not returned unlawfully as of January 1st, right, 2021, please let them know that it is possible that there may be a pathway for them to be able to return and then eventually become a citizen of the United States. So this is not very much talked about, but I think it is really, really an amazing piece of legislation to include this. So we're actually going to go back. So that was really the humanitarian track. Again, not the official name. It is just something I've noticed from sort of the fine print of the eligibility requirements and who counts and what waivers you can be allowed. That is one of them. So now really it's the wrapping up point for this one, which is the fast track. There is 3 different fast track options. And when I say fast track, it's because you're really going ahead in the general track process. If you remember, right, it's going from being a non-citizen to being an applicant, right, to then being an applicant, going to lawfully prospective immigrant, to then eventually become a lawfully permanent resident. Well, if you go with the fast track, right, I'll pull this up for you. What happens is you go straight to the lawful permanent resident status. So you're really hitting the end of it. So rather than having to wait 5 years to then do a change of status to lawful permanent resident, which is within the general track, you go straight to the end, right, to have your green card and only have 3 years of a wait to become a U.S. citizen. But really, it's only for these 3 different groups. All right, so within the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021, you have the DREAM Act. It is actually there. I did not expect it, but it's written very clearly that it is the DREAM Act. So who does that benefit? Really, it's about DACA recipients, right? Current DACA recipients, also known as Dreamers. I'm sure we're all very familiar with them. But what is needed to go with this? Well, as I mentioned before, right, you have the first 2 very general requirements. So that means that you have to pass all your background checks, pay any processing fees or associated fees with the application, and of course, successfully submit your application on time. So that's very important. You don't want to miss any window of application. Now, the other points are particularly here, which are specific to this route. You have to be able to prove that you are under 18 when you initially entered the U.S. So once you hit 18, you can no longer qualify for this route. You would have to go through the general track, which would, again, take an extra 5 years to eventually make it to being a U.S. citizen. Along with that, you need to have earned your high school degree, or a diploma, any kind of a commensurate award, or your GED, right? If you did not go the traditional or you left high school early. Additionally, there's another requirement that's a little bit different. It is that you need to show an academic, military, or employment requirement or get a waiver for it. So what this means is that you need to have attained a degree from an institution of higher ed or completed at least 2 years in good standing. So they did not explain what good standing is, so I'm not going to give my own definition for it. I would wait until there's a formal definition or a legal expert can give it. But you have to be in good standing leading to a bachelor's degree. So do keep that in mind. You have to either have a degree already completed or be 2 years in good standing leading up to a bachelor's degree, or any other recognized post-secondary credential, even from a more vocational education. So that will also count. You need some kind of education over years. Or you could also have served in the military for not less than 2 years. And if you are discharged, it has to be honorable. So do keep that in mind. And the last one, right, which is more on the employment, because we had academic, we have the military service. Now here's the employment route. And you don't have to do all three. You only have to do one of them. You have to have had earned income for periods totaling not less than 3 years, right? And not less than 75% of the time that you had valid employment authorization. So you have to meet those two requirements, right? So you have to have at least worked for 3 years, and in your entire time that you had work authorization, you had to have been working for at least 75% of that time that you had it, unless that period can actually be reduced through enrollment in higher education. That is one of the exceptions that actually helps to lower how much of employment time you would need to show. And the last piece is a little bit sort of the usual for U.S. citizens, but this would now become something that you need to have, is to be registered under the select service with the military, if you're required to. Just make sure that that's out the way. Now, you can also get some waivers. Again, it's very flexible. It's up to the Secretary of Homeland Security, but it would have to be very compelling, right? And it has to be a situational circumstance. So there's not too much waiver wiggle room when it comes to DACA. But the good thing is that, DACA is very popular. These people have also gone through a rigorous process to receive DACA protection. So this is only just an extra step to really, be on a stable pathway and a fast pathway to citizenship. There's a mention in the bill that there will be a special procedure for any applicant with DACA already granted, right? So you have had to have been granted DACA, and you need to meet the requirements for renewal of DACA to apply for the adjustment of status directly to having your green card. So that's the one thing to just keep in mind. You have to make sure that you're in perfect standing with the program to then just shift over when the time comes for this to be an option. And again, you'll just go straight into having a green card. It's going to be one of the most ideal pathways and very, very quick. Another thing that was mentioned in there is that states will hopefully get the power to determine residency requirements for higher education. Considering my background research was about this topic, I can tell you that it's an amazing piece to have in there, because it will now give states the opportunity to rewrite their tuition laws to open up funding to different immigrants, whether they're undocumented or going through this process, to give them in-state tuition, again, any kind of state funding. This is really a key piece that needs to be changed, and this is what's also included in the DREAM Act, actually, and within the body of the DREAM Act. So in going through this process, you also get access to federal housing and even to federal loans for education. So that's also an amazing thing. Now, the next piece, right, again, still within this fast track, is what is called the American Promise Act. So a very short piece, actually, within the bill. It is for TPS holders, right? So temporary protective status, yeah. So this particular group of people, they're a group of immigrants who cannot return back to their home because of circumstances outside of their control. Sometimes from natural disasters, they can be other situations, but they are protected within the U.S. From any immigration enforcement, and they also have work authorization. They're here living with us. So what's required? Again, the usual first two, which is just meaning your background checks are cleared, you paying all your fees, and you're submitting your app on time. Now, where it changes a bit, right? So this is specific to TPS recipients. There has to be continuous physical presence, again, right? The same requirement, but not just from January 1st of this year. You have to show that you've been continuously in the US from January 1st of 2017. So 4 years back. You have to show that each year you are here consistently without leaving the country for more than 180 days at a time each calendar year. If you can show that with the evidence that we outlined before, perfectly fine, you're going to be eligible. And this is also actually a pathway for anyone under the category of deferred enforced departure. Similar, but again, a little bit different. But that's it. That's really all you would need to apply for this, this relief. It's just to show that you've been here consistently from 2017 on the first day of that year, all the way through till the time that you are applying and that you've heard back from the decision of Homeland Security. That's really all there is to this one, to be honest. It's very, very short, and it's nowhere near as long as the DREAM Act. So I do want to go on to the last fast track, which surprised me, but I think it's a very welcomed one. It's to help our agricultural workers. All right, so very obviously named the Agricultural Workers Adjustment Act. So who does that help again? Agricultural workers. But what is needed is actually pretty reasonable. They need to have worked within a 5-year period, right? So this is in both cases, right? That's what the OR is for. In 5 years, up to the date of their application, they had to have worked either 2,300 hours of agricultural labor or services, or 400 workdays of the same, right, of agricultural work and services. Some of that is outlined in the actual bill. It's not 100% clear. I can really read out the definition, and it's going to be very circular in its words, right? So agricultural labor or services, without regard to whether the labor or service are seasonal or temporary in nature. Essentially, what it says is, regardless of whether or not it was temporary or if it's on and off, as long as it is agricultural labor or service, and you've worked either the number of hours within the 5 years or the number of days in those 5 years leading up to your application, you can qualify to have an expedited, right, so the fast track to get a green card through this program. So that is, again, an amazing opportunity for our agricultural workers who are working hard every day to provide for us. So that is actually really the summary of the details included in the U.S. Citizenship Act for the earned path to citizenship. I thought this was very important information to get out and start at least explaining who is eligible for this, who can qualify, who doesn't, and how you can best prepare. I do want to, again, highlight one important thing. If you are approached by either an attorney or any other official, a representative, telling you that they can prepare your documents for this reform, that they can help get you ready as long as you pay them money, that is fraud. There is no way right now, there's no existing avenue to prepare for this because it's just been introduced. We still have to wait, we still have to fight. That's the important thing. So if you are approached in this way, or you know someone who was and someone's thinking of going through with it, please inform them. That is fraud. They cannot help you right now. There's different numbers online that you can call to report it, and I highly recommend doing so to make sure that this person does not take advantage of another innocent person who just wants to be able to live peacefully in this country. But for now, that's really going to be really the end of this particular talk, right? The focus of the first piece of the act. It's very lengthy. I'm a single-man team, so I have not been able to go through the entire 350 pages in detail to take notes and then prepare a more formal presentation and talk for all of you. So the plan is, and I hope that if you can, make sure to either like our Facebook page or actually subscribe to our YouTube channel, because going forward, I will produce standalone videos, and I'm actually going to re-record this segment to have more graphics and details outlining the different processes that you have to go through and how you can be eligible or ineligible. So if that's something you like, again, follow us on Facebook, on YouTube, or even on Twitter. It's all scrolling across the bottom here. And you'll be able to have that those videos standalone again, that really details everything. And feel free to share it with people who you think will really benefit from that information. But for the time being, that's really what I can add right now, and I hope it's very helpful. Again, if anything comes up, please feel free to comment on the video. We see it in real time, and I'll be doing more live videos like this going forward to get this information out. But you can also, again, follow us to see more formal, structured talk with all these particular details of the entire Citizenship Act. But for now, that's all. And I hope that you can either join us tomorrow for the same segment in Spanish or join us next week for another amazing program. Thank you very much. And yeah, have a nice weekend.